Well, good evening. Welcome to the passage, and welcome to those who are watching online tonight. And we got back to that last week. I figured out. Where we were supposed to be. Last week we went ahead and jumped towards the end of the book, and so now we're coming back to chapter 6. And so I couldn't remember where we had left off. We talked about Deborah and I think Ehud was one of the stories we'd already told. So tonight we're going to look at the story of Gideon. And so that begins in chapter 6 and runs through the end of chapter 9. And so we're going to get as far as we can. I mean, my goal is just to look at chapter 6 and 7. So we're going to be reading a lot of the text and then just kind of pausing and talking about, some of the things that take place in it. So beginning in chapter 6, Judges chapter 6, verse 1, it says that the people of Israel did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, and the Lord gave them into the hand of Midian 7 years. And so pause there for just a second, because I'll remind you that that's really what the book of Judges is about. And it explains this cycle that takes place over and over again where Israel disobeys God, they sin. Usually it's in the form of idolatry, and they disobey, his command, his word. And so there's this cycle of sin. God allows them to be oppressed by a group of people. And I think I need to back up a couple of weeks, it's been more like a month ago, 5 weeks ago. I commented on Gideon and how the oppressors in Gideon's time were the Philistines, and I have to go back and correct that. It's not the Philistines, it's the Midianites. And so just in case someone in here is sharp enough to remember that I said the Philistines, but yeah, well, Jeff's back there. Jeff could have, he could have caught it. In fact, I'm surprised if he were here present the last time, he may have caught it, but he may not have been here that night. But it's the Midianites. And so the cycle is that Israel sins, they disobey God, and then God allows a nation to come in and oppress them, which causes them to cry out to God, and God hears their cries, and then he provides a judge to help bring peace back to the nation of Israel. And so one of the things that I want, let's go ahead and read the next few verses. So the cycles happened. They did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. The Lord gave them into the hand of Midian. And the hand of Midian overpowered Israel. And because of Midian, the people of Israel made for themselves the dens that are in the mountains and the caves and the strongholds. For whenever the Israelites planted crops, the Midianites and the Amalekites and the people of the east would come up against them. They would encamp against them and devour the produce of the land as far as Gaza, and leave no sustenance in Israel, and no sheep or ox or donkey. It says, for they would come up with their livestock and their tents. They would come like locusts in number. Both they and their camels could not be counted, so that they laid waste the land as they came in. And Israel was brought very low because of Midian, and the people of Israel cried out for help to the Lord. And so those few verses kind of give us the summary of the period of time in which God has given them over. So for 7 years this has been taking place. And notice what it says in here. And this is actually a fulfillment of a promise that Moses made to the people back in the book of Deuteronomy. At the end of Deuteronomy, there's this section that's called blessings and cursings. And children of Israel would receive blessing as long as they obeyed God. They would receive cursings whenever they would disobey him. And in fact, Moses said, almost word for word, what the author of Judges tells us right here. is that if you disobey, God says, if you disobey me, then I will allow other peoples to come in and consume your product, right? And so this is a fulfillment of that, and it was predicted back in Deuteronomy. And so that's the covenant relationship that Israel had with God. A covenant relationship which said, as long as my people obey me, I will bless them. But whenever they disobey me, then I will allow them to be cursed, to be oppressed. Now, I want to explain something to you. A lot of times we go back and we draw parallels with the church and the nation of Israel. But this is a parallel that can't really be drawn, okay? I want you to understand that that was the nature of their covenant. God said, I will take care of you and I will bless you as long as you obey me. And if you don't obey me, then you'll suffer the consequences of that, all right? We live under a different covenant. Praise God. I mean, because we live under a different covenant. And so it's no wonder that what some people do, and I'm sure you've experienced this, of speaking with people or listening to people who are convinced that as long as they obey God, then they're going to live a life of blessing, right? And if they're in good relationship with God, then He's going to bless them. Well, that's not the nature of the covenant anymore. The covenant that we are under is the covenant of grace and the covenant of mercy. And so Jesus has stepped in to borrow from Scott Inman's comments this past Sunday. You know, Jesus justified us, which means that He stepped in and took what was evil, our nature, and He made it right. And so that's the covenant that we live under, you know. Now, we're still required to walk with God, but it's not in the same sort of circumstance that we're reading here in the book of Judges. Does that make sense? Okay, because that was the very nature of their covenant. As long as you obey me, I will bless you. If you disobey me, then I will allow the consequences to play out. And so that's what he does. The Midianites have come upon them, and notice what they do. They wait for Israel to plant their crops mature, and then all of a sudden the Midianites and the Amalekites and some of the eastern peoples come upon the Israelites, and they raid them during harvest time, and they take everything, you know, and just basically the comparison is like a group of locusts. I don't know when the last big grasshopper invasion was, in farm country, prairie land or whatever, but used to that would happen. I mean, here in the United States, grasshoppers would come in and locusts. I mean, in the Middle East they call them locusts, but they would come in and they would just wipe out the crops. And so that's the comparison that the author makes to the Midianites coming in and raiding them. I mean, the analogy I guess we could use today was, imagine that you work hard for what you have, and someone else comes in and enjoys the spoils of that. We're not going to go too far with that analogy, because in some ways it's true. Even some of the things that people are starting to demand, like free college education and all that kind of stuff. Somebody's got to pay for that, right? And so we can appreciate a little bit of how Israel must have felt to be taken advantage of, to be raided like this. And yet, all of that is in God's plan to allow that. The reason He allows the oppressing nation to come in is so that the result of verse 6 would take place. He says that Israel was brought very low because of Midian. That's a good thing. I've used this illustration before, but how many of you remember Hee Haw? Okay. And you remember the barbershop thing? Oh, that's bad. No, that's good. Right? And so here's a case where it sounds like Israel was brought low. Oh, that's bad. No, that's good. Because until you're brought to that lowest point, sometimes you're not humble enough to seek God. And so that's what happens here. Israel's brought to a low point, and the people of Israel cry out for his help. They've got nowhere else to turn. So verse 7, when the people of Israel cried out to the Lord on account of the Midianites, the Lord sent a prophet to the people of Israel, and he said to them, "Thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, I led you up from Egypt and brought you out of the house of slavery, and I delivered you from the hand of the Egyptians and from the hand of all who oppressed you, and drove them out before you and gave you their land. And I said to you, I am the Lord your God. You shall not fear the gods of the Amorites in whose land you dwell, but you have not obeyed my voice." And so there's a message of there's a message, a confrontational message that this prophet lays out there from God. The people are crying out to God, how unfair this is. I just had a conversation with someone today. And you remember how we've told you, and you've heard most of us who preach up here, you've heard us say this, that a lot of times when you're talking to people in our culture, one of their major questions is, it's not really even a question. Most of the time it's made in the form of a comment, which says, I would believe in a God if you can explain to me how a loving God can allow so much human suffering. Okay? And the best that I've got is that we live in a fallen world. And the good news, here's the good news, because I take it a little further than that. We live in a fallen world. It's a result of our own rebellion that we live in this fallen world. But the good news is that God doesn't want to leave us there. And so there's where I take off with it, right? And so basically, that's what's happening here. The people of Israel crying out, basically questioning, God, why is this happening to us? So God provides a prophet, and the prophet says to the people, it's your own fault. You disobeyed. I've given you this land. And even as I gave you the land, you didn't do what you were supposed to do. You were supposed to drive the people out. And so I left some of them here to test you, and you're not passing the test. And so he points out that they have disobeyed, that they've not followed his voice. All right, so verse 11. Now the angel of the Lord came and sat under the terebinth at Ophrah. Now some versions may say the oak at Ophrah, which belonged to Joash the Abiezrite. I'm not getting that right. But that's okay. While his son Gideon was beating out wheat in the winepress to hide it from the Midianites. Okay, so we'll stop there for just a second. It says that the angel of the Lord came, and so just kind of in review, I guess the best way to put it, because I'm not going to say you all may agree with that, but who have I told you that I think the angel of the Lord is? The angel of the Lord. All right, it's the pre-incarnate Jesus. And so he shows up, in some sort of bodily form, whatever, but he shows up. And so Gideon is beating out wheat in the winepress to hide it from the Midianites. Now, I don't know, in the olden days, that dates me a little bit too, but in the older days, when you were winnowing wheat, basically they would put the wheat out on a big tarp or a big piece of fabric, and they would toss that wheat, and the grain is heavier than the chaff, and so the chaff would blow away while the wheat would fall back down. And so it says that he is beating the wheat, or that's what he's doing. He's separating the wheat from the chaff, and basically, to get the picture of this, a wine press was usually set up in a lower area, okay? And in fact, it suggests that this wine press was even enclosed. And so in a wine press, they would get in and they would basically press the grapes or stomp the grapes, and the juice would flow out of that, and they would collect the juice. So, and it's certainly not made for the job that Gideon is doing. In separating the wheat, in the harvest process, the whole idea was to use the wind. And here's Gideon hiding away in order for the Midianites not to see it, not to come down and steal it. And so you got to figure the description of him beating out wheat in the wine press is just kind of funny to me, because you got to wonder how productive he's actually being. If there's no wind in that location to separate it, how productive is he being? And so that's what he's busy doing. And verse 12 says that the angel of the Lord appeared to him and said to him, "The Lord is with you, O mighty man of valor." And in looking at a lot of the commentaries and things, Jesus or the angel of the Lord is making a point here when he calls him "O mighty man of valor," because how mighty a man of valor is he if he's hiding himself? Okay? And so, but at the same time, what Jesus is doing, and I don't want to lose track of this because it's important. What Jesus is doing is he's telling Gideon that he is the man that he's selected for the job. But as we go through, we're going to see that even though he's the one that the Lord has selected, Gideon keeps doubting himself over and over and over and over again. All right? So, the Lord is with you, O mighty man of valor. And Gideon said to him, "Please, my Lord, if the Lord is with us, why then has all this happened to us? And where are all his wonderful deeds that our fathers recounted to us, saying, 'Did not the Lord bring us up from Egypt?' But now the Lord has forsaken us and given us into the hand of Midian." And the Lord turned to him and said, "Go in this might of yours and save Israel from the hand of Midian. Do not I send you?" And he said to him, "Please, Lord, how can I save Israel? Behold, my clan is the weakest in Manasseh, and I am the least in my father's house." And the Lord said to him, "But I will be with you, and you shall strike the Midianites as one man." And he said to him, "If now I have found favor in your eyes, then show me a sign that it is you who speak with me. Please do not depart from here until I come to you and bring out my present and set it before you." And he said, "I will stay till you return." All right, so the conversation kind of goes that Gideon says to the angel of the Lord, if the Lord has favor on us, if the Lord is with us, then why are all these bad things happening, right? And so the Lord, the angel of the Lord, or the Lord, turned to him and said, "I want you to go in this might of yours and save Israel from the hand of Midian." And again, it's pointing out, I might as well just kind of cut to the chase of the point of this story. The Apostle Paul says that it's when we are at our weakest that God is strong. And so a part of what the angel of the Lord is pointing out to Gideon is you think that you are, you don't think that you would be effective in this role. But I'm telling you, you're the perfect person for it, because there's nothing puffed up about you. There's nothing, assuming about you. You're very unassuming. And I can work with someone like you. I mean, you guys, you kind of get that? You ever had that person that you, maybe a coworker or maybe a relative, I don't know, hopefully not a spouse, but you ever had that person that was so proud and it was hard to work with them, right? And so the Lord is saying to Gideon in this place, you're the kind of person that I can use. I mean, and it's what he always does. I mean, he chose a shepherd boy for a king. He chose 12 uneducated men to be his apostles. And he chose the Apostle Paul, who Paul says he's the chief of all sinners. And that's how God operates. You know, maybe gifted, talented people, yes, but people who are moldable. And so the Lord says to Gideon, I want you to go in this might of yours, and I want you to fight for Israel. And then he argues again, Lord, how can I save Israel? My clan's the weakest. I'm the least in my father's house. And then the Lord said this, and this is key, but I will be with you. I will be with you. You know, Tony Evans in the Kingdom Man series says that as you start to transition into a kingdom man, one of the things that you have to do is you have to let go of your past. Then you have to embrace your inheritance. But perhaps most importantly, you have to focus on God instead of other people. Let me just say that again. You have to focus upon God instead of the other people around you. And you're going to see that play out as we go through the story here, but it's already playing out. I mean, who has told, I mean, how has Gideon come to the conclusion that his is the weakest clan in all of Manasseh? If it's not the way other people have treated them and the things that other people have said. Who has demonstrated to Gideon that he is the least in all of his family? It's a learned behavior. And so the Lord shows up, and the Lord says, you need to pay more attention to me and less attention to the people around you. That's a pretty good lesson for the church if you think about it. We need to begin to pay more attention to who He is rather than the direction in which our society is headed. And I don't mean we're not concerned about the direction in which our society, but we should not be consumed by that, and we should not be overly worried about that, because we serve the living God. And so he says, if I've found any favor in your eyes, then please give me a sign. And he says, stay here until I return to bring you my offering. He says a present, but it's an offering. So verse 19 says, Gideon went into his house, prepared a young goat, unleavened cakes from an ephah of flour. The meat he put in a basket, and the broth he put in a pot, and brought them to him under the terebinth and presented them. And the angel of God said to him, take the meat and the unleavened cakes and put them on this rock, and pour the broth over them. And he did so. Then the angel of the Lord reached out the tip of the staff that was in his hand and touched the meat and the unleavened cakes. And fire sprang up from the rock. Sorry. Sprang up from the rock, consumed the meat and the unleavened cakes. And the angel of the Lord vanished from his sight. Then Gideon perceived that he was the angel of the Lord. And Gideon said, alas, O Lord God, for now I have seen the angel of the Lord face to face. But the Lord said to him, peace be to you, do not fear, you shall not die. You know, kind of this almost superstitious viewpoint that if they've come in contact with the angel of the Lord, then they're probably going to die, right? And so the Lord says to him, you're not going to die. Then Gideon built an altar there to the Lord and called it, the Lord is Peace. To this day it still stands at Ophrah, which belongs to the Abiezrites. Yeah, I think that's right. Abazirites. That night the Lord said to him, take your father's bull and the second bull, 7 years old, and pull down the altar of Baal that your father has, and cut down the Asherah that is beside it, and build an altar to the Lord your God on the top of the stronghold here with stones laid in due order. Then take the second bull and offer it as a burnt offering with the wood of the Asherah that you shall cut down. So Gideon took 10 men of his servants and did as the Lord had told him. But because he was too afraid of his family and the men of the town to do it by day, he did it by night. All right, but he's still obedient. Now this is Joash, his father, he's the one that has erected this idol to Baal and the Asherah pole, right? And so he goes and he tears it down. So in the morning it says, when the men of the town rose early in the morning, behold, the altar of Baal was broken down, and the Asherah beside it was cut down, and the second bull was offered on the altar that had been built. And they said to one another, who has done this thing? And after they had searched and inquired, they said, Gideon, the son of Joash, has done this thing. Then the men of the town said to Joash, bring out your son that he may die, for he has broken down the altar of Baal and cut down the Asherah beside it. So they're thirsty for his blood because of this injustice. Notice how quick they are to jump on Gideon in what he's done to false idols. But think about the progression that it must have taken for them to step away from the way of the Lord. And not too many of them were upset about that. And we'll get to why in just a second. But Joash actually answers in a brilliant way. And Joash is the one who had these idols set up in the first place. But what Joash figures out is, my son may have torn them down, but if Baal is real, and if Asherah is real, then they can fight for themselves. And so he says, will you contend for Baal, or will you save him? Whoever contends for him shall be put to death by morning. If he is a god, let him contend for himself, because his altar has been broken down. And so he comes to the defense of his son, Gideon. You would probably think, since he's the one that put him up, he would be the one that would be most upset about it. But evidently, he's been convicted by this event as well. And so he says to the accusers of Gideon, he says, let Baal fight for himself. If he really is a god, then he's quite capable. And so he defends his son. In fact, what he says is, if any of you touch my son, he doesn't say it in so many words, but he says, if any of you contend for Baal, you will be dead by morning. And so Joash comes to give Gideon's aid. Verse 32 says, therefore on that day Gideon was called Jerub-Baal, that is to say, let Baal contend against him, because he broke down his altar. And who knows that they gave him that name at first as a joke, right? Kind of teasing him about it a little bit. Now, all the Midianites and the Amalekites and the people of the east came together, and they crossed the Jordan and encamped in the valley of Jezreel. But the Spirit of the Lord clothed Gideon, and he sounded the trumpet, and the Abzites, that's what I'm going to call them. The Abzites were called out to follow him, and he sent messengers throughout all Manasseh, and they too were called out to follow him. And he sent messengers to Asher, Zebulun, and Naphtali, and they went up to meet him. So 4 tribes have gathered some troops together. Then Gideon said to God, if you will save Israel by my hand as you have said, behold, I'm laying a fleece of wool on the threshing floor. If there's dew on the fleece alone and it is dry on all of the ground, then I shall know that you will save Israel by my hand as you have said. And it was so. When he rose early next morning and squeezed the fleece, he wrung enough dew from the fleece to fill a bowl with water. All right, so now, again, I'm showing, one of the things you need to see here, even though he's the instrument that God has chosen, Gideon keeps doubting himself. And yet he's testing the Lord with it. I mean, the first test was, will you hang around here while I go and get an offering for you? And remember when that offering was consumed, he was convinced that who he had just been in the presence of was the Lord. But now, as the battle's coming closer, the doubt's sneaking in again. And so he says, I'm going to lay this fleece down, and if you can dampen this fleece and keep all the ground around it dry, then I'll believe that you are who you are, or I believe that this is possible. I'll know that you will save Israel by my hand. And it says it was so. But verse 39 says, Then Gideon said to God, Let not your anger burn against me. Let me speak just once more. Please let me test just once more with the fleece. Please let it be dry on the fleece only, and on all the ground let there be dew. And God did so that night. And it was dry on the fleece only, and on all the ground there was dew. Then Jerubbaal, that is Gideon, and all the people who were with him rose early and encamped beside the spring of Harod. And the camp of Midian was north of them, and by the hill of Morah in the valley. The Lord said to Gideon, The people with you are too many for me to give the Midianites into their hand, lest Israel boast over me, saying, My own hand has saved me. Now therefore proclaim in the ears of the people, saying, Whoever is fearful and trembling, let him return home and hurry away from Mount Gilead. And so then 22,000 of the people returned, and 10,000 remained. And that might seem like a strange thing, but that actually was something that Israel did almost every time they went into battle. They gave the option for those who were afraid to just go home, right? And so, and notice first of all, what's his purpose for allowing that to happen? In this case, what's he say here? What's the Lord say to Gideon? He says, there's too many of you. Why? What?
They'll boast that they themselves got themselves out of the problem.
Yeah. And so God is saying, I want to make sure that everyone understands that it's me. All right? And so 22,000 of them go home. And here's what struck me. You think Gideon wanted to go with them? I kind of think he probably did, but by this time I think Gideon is, not that when 22,000 of them walk out or walk home, go back home, he probably was a little unnerved because, even with the fighting force of 32,000, the Midianites have 135,000 or something like that. And so they're grossly outnumbered, but it's going to get worse. So 10,000 remain. And the Lord said to Gideon, The people are still too many. Take them down to the water, and I will test them for you there. In any one of whom I say to you, This one shall go with you, shall go with you. And any one of whom I say to you, This one shall not go with you, shall not go. So he brought the people down to the water. And the Lord said to Gideon, Everyone who laps the water with his tongue as a dog laps, you shall set by himself. Likewise, everyone who kneels down to drink. And the number of those who lapped, putting their hands to their mouths, was 300 men. But all the rest of the people knelt down to drink water. And the Lord said to Gideon, With the 300 men who lapped, I will save you and give the Midianites into your hand, and let all the others go, every man to his home. So the people took provisions in their hands and their trumpets, and he sent all the rest of Israel, every man to his tent, but retained the 300 men, and the camp of Midian was below him in the valley. And so I've always heard it explained this way, that the reason he chooses those who scoop up the water in their hands and lap it is that they are in battle-ready position. They are more alert. and those who kneel down are not really well aware of their surroundings. And so whatever the case, what is that? 9,700 of them go home, and 300 of them stay to fight. Actually, they don't go completely home; they just go back to their tents. All right. Verse 9, that same night the Lord said to him, arise, go down against the camp, for I have given it into your hand. But if you are afraid to go down to the camp with Purah, your servant, and you shall hear what they say, and afterward your hand shall be strengthened to go down against the camp. Then he went down with Purah, his servant, to the outpost of the armed men who were in the camp. And the Midianites and the Amalekites and all the people of the east lay along the valley like locusts in abundance, and their camels were without number, as the sand that is on the seashore in abundance. When Gideon came, behold, a man was telling a dream to his comrade. And he said, behold, I dreamed a dream, and behold, a cake of barley bread tumbled into the camp of Midian, and came to the tent and struck it so that it fell, and turned it upside down so that the tent lay flat. And so barley bread is barley bread, or a loaf of barley bread, was basically representative. Barley was the poorest. It was bread for the poor. Okay, and so. Don't know exactly the significance of that, except maybe to say that, that's how Gideon viewed himself, not as, pretty humble. And so that's the point of barley bread. A barley loaf was kind of a humble kind of bread. And so it says that his comrade answered, this is no other than the sword of Gideon, the son of Joash, a man of Israel. God has given into his hand Midian and all the camp. As soon as Gideon heard the telling of the dream and its interpretation, he worshiped, and he returned to the camp of Israel and said, arise, for the Lord has given the host of Midian into your hand. And he divided the 300 men into 3 companies, and put trumpets into the hands of all of them, and empty jars with torches inside the jars. And he said to them, look at me and do likewise. When I come to the outskirts of the camp, do as I do. When I blow the trumpet, I and all who are with me, then blow the trumpets also on every side of the camp, of all the camp, and shout, for the Lord and for Gideon. So Gideon and the 100 men who were with him came to the outskirts of the camp at the beginning of the middle watch, when they had just set the watch, and they blew their trumpets and smashed the jars that were in their hands. Then the 3 companies blew the trumpets and broke the jars. They held in their left hands the torches, and in their right hands the trumpets to blow, and they cried out, a sword for the Lord and for Gideon. Every man stood in his place around the camp, and all the army ran. They cried out and fled. When they blew the 300 trumpets, the Lord set every man's sword against his comrade and against all the army. And the army fled as far as Beth Shittah toward Zerah, as far as the border of Abel Meholah by Tabbath. And the men of Israel were called out from Naphtali and from Asher, from all Manasseh, and they pursued after Midian. So those who had been sent home were also called back out, and so they pursue the nation of Midian. Gideon sent messengers throughout all the hill country of Ephraim, saying, come down against the Midianites and capture the waters against them as far as Beth Barah and also the Jordan. So all the men of Ephraim were called out, and they captured the waters as far as Beth Barah and also the Jordan. And they captured the 2 princes of Midian, Oreb and Zeb. They killed Oreb at the rock of Oreb. And I was reading one commentator, and they said, it probably wasn't known as the rock of Oreb before he was killed there. Okay? But after that, it was known as the rock of Oreb. And Zeb they killed at the winepress of Zeb. Then they pursued Midian, and they brought the heads of Oreb and Zeeb to Gideon across the Jordan. All right. And so we've kind of read through all of it. And so now I want to go back and just kind of, glean a few things from it. Of course, understanding that we're living under a different covenant. I mean, we've discussed that a little bit already. But, what got Israel into trouble? Why is it that you think they were so quick to disobey the one true God, and yet, for example, be so upset that Gideon would destroy the idols that had been erected? What's the difference? Yeah, the only thing would be sacrifice and even what's the word I want to use here? Because Baal and Asherah were fertility gods, and so some of the participation would have been in actually having orgies. Asherah, there were prostitutes related to Asherah and that sort of thing. And so I guess the way I would put it is that it's a good point, because those idols, those false gods, were easier to serve than Yahweh. Okay, so that's a good point. What else? I mean, what else can you think of that marks a difference of why it would be so easy to slide away, to slip away from following God's law and His rule over them? What? All right, so they were intermarrying with other nations, right? Okay. Complacency. Okay.
I mean, they were living in the land of plenty. They had everything they wanted.
All right. So they got lazy in it. It's easier to go along and get along. I mean, than to follow, God's direction. The people around them looked different they lived differently than the values that they lived. And honestly, that there is a place where we can make a comparison today with the church. When the church is consumed by the same things that the rest of the culture are consumed by. When the church decides to compromise because it's easier to go along and get along than it is to remain the only word I can think of is absent, and that's not what I'm looking for. To remain, outside of the way the world lives. I mean, it was the people around them that caused their downfall. And I mean, let's face it, we live in a culture like that. How many denominations are you seeing caving in to things that are that go against God? And not just congregations, but how many Christians have you witnessed who cave in to the pressures of the society around them, and decide to just go along with it. So, I mean, anything else that you can think of? I guess I'll go back to that point. And part of that is because this is the world we know. Okay? And so often, those pressures, peer pressure, criticism, all those kinds of things, those are tangible things that we actually experience and feel. And so often, unless you're making an attempt to walk with Him, sometimes God doesn't feel all that tangible, especially whenever we're in the midst of a struggle. I mean, I can't tell you the number of Christians who've told me, I realize that God is with me, but I don't feel Him there, right? And that's where the church comes in. We're supposed to be the ones that help them feel Him there with them, experience Him. And so that's a big part of it. And we're a people who just don't like being, uncomfortable. And so when the world criticizes us, and that's another application I think I'd like to make in this. Joash makes the comment that if Baal is a god, if he is a god, then he should be capable of fighting for himself. And I think as Christians, sometimes we need to do a better job of trusting that God is going to fight the battle for us, and that we focus on what we're supposed to be focusing on. And I mean, with what we've been talking about over the last few months, what are we supposed to be focusing on? Making disciples. I mean, do we necessarily need to be marching in protest somewhere? No, we need to be doing what we're supposed to be doing. And
well, I was just going to say that means we have to give up control, and that's not something we want to do.
yeah,
We think we have control as long as we're in charge.
yeah. It's a hard thing to give up control, to give it over to God's timing. I was having, I don't even remember who I was talking to, but it was somebody this week, and we were talking about God's timing. And I made the comment to them. They said, they basically said, well, everything's just basically going to happen in God's time. And I said, you know what, you're right. Which should tell us that our timing makes no difference. I mean, we might as well get used to that it's going to happen in His time. And so why be so stressed about it? And so, yeah, I mean, God is the one who is in control. And so, and then, finally, what I'd like to discuss is that in our weakness, He is made strong. In fact, in 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verses, I believe it's 8 and 9, but Paul writes there and says, he's talking about the thorn in the flesh and that sort of thing, and he says, but the Lord has shown me that His grace is sufficient for me, that when I'm at my weakest, that He is strong. So why is that true? Why is that true?
Kind of like what I just said, I think it's when we're at our weakest, we're vulnerable and we've given up. We have nothing left. And so we finally look to Him.
Okay.
We don't fight Him so hard.
We don't fight Him so hard. Anything else? I mean, anybody? So where, like what areas are we talking about being, where he uses our weaknesses? I mean, what kind of weaknesses will he use?
Seems like when you have health problems,
Hmm.
when you have health problems, most people go to God or when they lose somebody dear to them.
Okay. All right. He said like with health problems or something like that. But like, and I'm not asking anybody to confess their weakness or anything, but how can God take a weakness and demonstrate through us?
Well, if you feel like you don't have the ability to communicate effectively to someone, to witness to someone properly, God says, I'll provide the words for you.
Okay. But how many people do you think actually trust him to do that?
You have to try before you figure out that it really works.
Mm. I mean, what are some areas, and I'm not asking you to share specifically, but what are some areas where maybe you have experienced God using a weakness?
When you don't feel adequate for a task that he has for you,
Okay. But you go ahead and do it anyway?
hopefully.
Hopefully. Yeah. Well, how about, have you ever had an experience where someone is confessing something to you, and so you in turn confess something that's similar? And God takes that and he uses it. I mean, you can't believe how he will use that. When someone, when you're transparent with someone, and believe me, being transparent with someone, what you're sharing with them, if you're transparent, then that means you're sharing something about yourself that, most people would, or not most people, but some people might condemn you for that. But you're open and you're honest about it, you lay it out there. It's the idea of, hey, I'm Miles and I'm an addict. Or I'm Miles and I'm a sinner. Right? Taking our weaknesses and using them for strength. And so it could be a lot of things. It could be your self-esteem. I mean, you're standing up back there. Were you going to say something?
I was just thinking about whatever the plank in our eye has been at some point. That's what it is.
Yeah.
As we work on that, we get to use that
Right.
in other situations.
Right. Paul even uses it in terms of, there's groups of people they have dispute with each other, and it's over the eating of meat offered to idols. And so he refers to one group as the stronger brother and the other group as the weaker brother. But they're interchangeable, okay? For some people, their weakness is their pride. And God says, if you'll just give that over to me, if you just, allow me to do the work. And so that's the story of Gideon. That's why I enjoy the story of Gideon so much, is because I've heard preachers refer to Gideon as kind of like the Barney Fife of the judges, I'm not quite sure he was that bad, okay? But he surely doubted himself. And that's part of the reason I really like this story, is because it is all about giving your doubts over to God. It also teaches us that God's not going to be upset with us if we question him, you know? Or, you know, when we do have those doubts, he's not going to be condemning of us. He simply wants us to come to a place where we trust him. We trust him with our very best. We trust him with our very least. We just completely, give trust to him. And so next week we'll continue with the story of Gideon and kind of his downfall, if you will. So, I know, like I said, I realize that we've read through, but I just felt like the most effective way to do this tonight was to read these 2 chapters and then just briefly discuss some things in them. And so next week we will resume with chapters 8 and 9. So anything we need to be praying for Diane and Ralph and
She's home.
She is home? Okay.
Goes back middle of May,
All right.
whatever they decide.
Okay. So, anything else we need to be praying about?
You guys,
Hmm?
you guys.
Oh, yeah. Chris Brown and I leave tomorrow morning, 6 o'clock tomorrow morning. So, for Lake of the Ozarks. So. What?
Just an unspoken prayer request that could be, I don't want to say on mine.
Okay.
Jennifer.
Okay. All right. Well, Tim, will you dismiss us, please?
Father God, thank you for this day. Thank you for allowing us to come into your house tonight to divide your word, to learn from the lessons that you have given to the Israelites, that they might develop a trust with you, to be mindful that you are God and that they are not. And as we learn from Gideon, that it doesn't matter